Have you ever noticed how the loudest message you can send in a relationship sometimes isn't through words at all, but through silence? Especially when that silence comes from someone who usually gives deeply, loves openly, and shows up more than anyone else. That silence isn't empty, it's powerful. And for the avoidant partner, it can feel absolutely unbearable. When we talk about avoidant attachment, we're talking about people who pull away when intimacy gets too real or when emotions feel overwhelming. They create space, distance, walls. But then something fascinating happens when they meet what I call the super empath, the person who naturally gives, forgives, and extends themselves emotionally, sometimes to their own detriment. Now, here's the twist when a super empath decides to stop giving, stop explaining, and instead meet the avoidant with calm, cold silence. It flips the entire script. Suddenly, the avoidant loses the control they thought they had. Because silence from someone who has always given everything, that's deafening. Why can't 99% of avoidants handle this silence? Because it exposes them. It reveals the cracks in their defense system. It forces them to feel the absence of the very love they were taking for granted. And for once, they don't get to dictate the emotional temperature. The empath does. This silence isn't punishment, it's a boundary, it's a reclaiming of power, and it teaches both sides something crucial. Love cannot thrive without respect, reciprocity, and emotional availability. When someone who has always been expressive, nurturing, and generous with their emotions suddenly goes silent, it doesn't come across as empty space. It carries weight. It's not just the absence of words, it's the absence of reassurance, warmth, and safety that the other person has become accustomed to. For an avoidant who often expects the empath to keep reaching out, keep bridging the gap, and keep softening the distance they create, that silence can feel like a sudden collapse of their entire safety net. What makes this so powerful is that silence from a super empath is never casual. It is deliberate. It arrives after countless moments of being patient, forgiving, and understanding. It's the result of giving so much energy that the empath finally recognizes that words no longer serve them. At that point, silence becomes the language of self-respect. When an empath pulls back into silence, it shifts the emotional balance in a way that feels jarring to the avoidant. Normally, the avoidant relies on a predictable pattern they withdraw, and the empath pursues. The empath reassures, explains, reaches for connection, and the avoidant maintains distance while still benefiting from the attention. But silence interrupts that loop. It breaks the cycle. Suddenly, the avoidant doesn't receive that flood of emotional energy they've come to expect, and they're left with the echo of their own withdrawal. This is where silence reveals its power. It reflects back to the avoidant the very emptiness they've been trying to avoid within themselves. Silence also removes the avoidant's usual tools of control. When words are flowing, avoidants can minimize, deflect, or retreat further. They can dismiss arguments or shut down conversations to re-establish their comfort. But silence doesn't give them that opportunity. There's nothing to push against, nothing to dismiss. It's an invisible wall they can't dismantle with logic or avoidance. The empath's stillness creates a kind of mirror, and in that mirror, the avoidant has to face the truth their behavior is being felt, and it has consequences. For the empath, silence is also a reclamation of energy. Instead of wasting more words trying to be heard, they allow space to speak for them. It's not passive, it's incredibly active in its impact. It communicates, I will not chase you. I will not convince you. I will not pour into a cup that has no bottom. This quiet boundary is one of the most powerful tools an empath can use, not because it punishes the avoidant, but because it honors their own emotional capacity. What the avoidant experiences in response is a form of disorientation. They are so used to equating distance with safety that they never consider what happens when the other person matches their distance but does it with calm strength. Suddenly, the avoidance pattern doesn't work anymore. They're no longer the one dictating the terms of closeness or separation. The silence of the empath redefines the dynamic, and for the avoidant, that can feel unbearable because in that quiet, all of their unaddressed fears and insecurities rush to the surface without distraction. Avoidants often construct their relationships around the idea of maintaining distance as a form of safety. To them, closeness can feel threatening, intimacy can feel overwhelming, and emotional dependence can feel suffocating. Their instinct is to pull away when someone gets too close, not because they don't care, but because vulnerability feels dangerous. They build emotional walls and convince themselves that space keeps them in control. Yet, when faced with the silence of a super empath, that distance they've always relied on begins to work against them. Instead of feeling like safety, it starts to feel like abandonment. This is because avoidants, despite their fear of closeness, still need reassurance at a deeper level. They may not admit it, and they may not even be conscious of it, but part of them expects the empath to always be there, to soften the edges, to bridge the gaps, to do the work of holding the relationship together. The empath's constant availability allows the avoidant to believe they can withdraw without real consequences. But when silence replaces that steady stream of reassurance, the avoidant is left with a void they can't easily escape. Suddenly, the emotional cushion they've leaned on disappears, and they're forced to feel the absence they've tried to avoid all along. The discomfort is magnified because silence does not provide an outlet for control. Avoidants often manage emotional tension by creating space or shutting down dialogue, but when the empath chooses silence, that very strategy is turned on its head. The avoidant doesn't get to define the terms of the interaction anymore. They can't retreat if there's nowhere to retreat from. Instead, they're faced with an eerie stillness that makes them question their own significance. It's as though the empath's silence whispers, "You are no longer the center of my emotional focus." And that reality is deeply unsettling. For someone who has become used to holding power through distance, this silence is destabilizing. It reveals the truth that distance is only comfortable when it is one-sided. When both people pull back, the avoidant realizes they are not immune to the very void they created. Their discomfort grows because silence forces them into contact with feelings they've buried: fear of rejection, fear of being unlovable, fear of not being enough. The empath's silence then becomes a mirror reflecting these hidden insecurities, and avoidants often find that unbearable because it challenges their entire defense system. The irony is that while avoidants may believe they crave space, what they truly fear is the permanence of being left alone. Silence mimics that permanence. It feels like the emotional abandonment they've been running from their whole lives, but with a twist. It's not chaotic, it's not dramatic, it's calm and final. That calmness is what makes it so piercing. The empath's silence doesn't come with blame or begging, it comes with clarity. And that clarity makes the avoidant's usual coping strategies feel powerless, leaving them face to face with a discomfort they can't easily escape. The dynamic between an avoidant and a super empath often follows a predictable rhythm. The avoidant pulls back when they feel overwhelmed or emotionally threatened, and the empath, with their natural instinct to heal and connect, steps forward to close the gap. This chase and distance cycle keeps the avoidant in a position of control because they dictate when closeness happens and when it stops. They know consciously or unconsciously that the empath will usually lean in, explain, soothe, or try to fix things. That pattern allows the avoidant to feel secure in their distance without ever having to risk true vulnerability. But when the empath stops playing that role and replaces pursuit with silence, everything changes. The control the avoidant once held slips through their fingers. Silence flips the script because it removes the avoidant's expectation of the empath's constant pursuit. The empath is no longer chasing, no longer offering emotional safety nets, no longer doing the work to hold the relationship together. Instead, they step back and let the absence of words do the talking. For the avoidant, this shift feels destabilizing. They suddenly realize they're not the only one with the power to create space. The silence demonstrates that the empath, too, has the ability to pull away, but in a way that doesn't look like fear or avoidance. It looks like strength. That strength directly challenges the avoidant's belief that they control the pace and depth of the connection. The silence also changes the emotional temperature in the relationship. Where the avoidant once felt confident that they could withdraw and still be pursued, now they're confronted with a new energy, calm detachment. The empath isn't fighting, isn't pleading, and isn't trying to break down walls. They're simply letting the silence speak. That calmness removes the avoidant's leverage because conflict or pursuit can be deflected, but silence cannot. It cannot be argued with or manipulated. The dynamic shifts from the avoidant calling the shots to the empath quietly holding the reins even without effort. What makes this especially powerful is that silence forces the avoidant to face their own dependence on the empath's emotional labor. They may not have realized how much they relied on the empath's constant presence, reassurance, or efforts to repair the bond. But once those efforts stop, the avoidant is left with an uncomfortable truth. The connection they thought they were controlling was actually being sustained by the other person all along. The shift in control is not just about silence, it's about the revelation of who was truly holding the relationship together. This new dynamic can feel deeply unsettling for the avoidant because it strips away the illusion of control they've held on to. The empath's silence communicates that the avoidant no longer dictates the terms of closeness or distance. It is the empath who has chosen to stop giving, stop explaining, and stop reaching. And in that moment, the avoidant is forced to face the unfamiliar reality of powerlessness, an experience that challenges their defenses and brings all their hidden fears to the surface. When a super empath falls silent, it does something that words often fail to achieve. It exposes the hidden truths of the relationship. An avoidant, who has long depended on the empath's endless patience, begins to realize that the love and care they took for granted is not infinite. Silence strips away the illusion that the empath will always be there to fill the emotional gaps. It shows, without accusation or argument, that there are limits, and once those limits are reached, the dynamic changes permanently. For the avoidant, this revelation is jarring because it confronts them with a reality they rarely consider. Love that is not nurtured can, in fact, be withdrawn. This exposure is especially powerful because silence doesn't announce itself with anger or drama. It arrives quietly, but its impact is undeniable. When the empath goes silent, they are no longer explaining why they are hurt, no longer justifying their feelings, and no longer negotiating for closeness. That absence of words forces the avoidant to sit in the very emptiness they've created. It reveals that emotional availability is not optional if a relationship is to thrive. Without the empath's constant giving, what's left is a reflection of how much, or how little, the avoidant has truly invested. The silence also exposes the fragility of the avoidant's coping strategies. Avoidants often believe that by creating distance, they can protect themselves from vulnerability. But when silence enters the picture, that distance is no longer protective, it's isolating. The avoidant has to face the truth that their defenses don't just shield them from pain, they also block them from love. In the empath's silence, the avoidant encounters the cost of their behavior in its purest form, the absence of connection. That absence forces them to confront the fact that while they thought they were in control, they were actually dependent on the empath's willingness to keep showing up. Another truth revealed by silence is that relationships are reciprocal by nature. The empath's silence communicates that love cannot be sustained by one person's effort alone. It underscores that giving without receiving is unsustainable, no matter how strong or resilient the empath may be. This is a painful but necessary truth for the avoidant to see because it dismantles the belief that the empath's affection will always remain. No matter how distant or unresponsive they are, silence is proof that the empath's love is conditional, not in a manipulative way, but in a healthy, self-respecting way. For the avoidant, these truths can feel brutal because they highlight vulnerabilities they've tried hard to ignore. Silence reveals that the empath's love was never guaranteed, that their patience had limits, and that connection requires presence, not absence. It exposes the reality that walls may keep out pain, but they also keep out intimacy. And once the empath stops filling the silence with words, the avoidant has no choice but to confront the emptiness they've created and the possibility that the connection they relied on may never return in the same way again. When silence enters the dynamic between a super empath and an avoidant, it often becomes the turning point that determines the future of the relationship. For the empath, the choice to go silent isn't about punishment, it's about preservation. It marks the moment they stop explaining and over-giving and instead choose to protect their own energy. For the avoidant, however, that silence creates an unavoidable crossroad. They can no longer ignore the impact of their distance or rely on the empath's endless patience to sustain the bond. At this stage, growth becomes the only path forward, whether together or apart. One of the most powerful aspects of silence is that it invites self-reflection. The avoidant is pushed to confront patterns they've carefully avoided examining. In the absence of the empath's words, they hear their own. In the absence of the empath's pursuit, they notice the hollowness of their withdrawal. This discomfort can awaken something new, an awareness that their defenses may have kept them safe in the past, but they are now preventing them from experiencing genuine intimacy. The silence becomes an uncomfortable mirror, showing them not only how they've been relating, but also what they stand to lose if they don't change. For the empath, this moment of silence is equally transformative. It gives them clarity about their own boundaries and needs. By stepping back, they realize they don't have to beg for love. They don't have to keep proving their worth, and they don't have to exhaust themselves just to maintain connection. Silence allows them to measure the avoidant's willingness to grow. If the avoidant steps forward, it's no longer because they were chased. It's because they chose to, and that choice is what creates the possibility of a healthier, more balanced dynamic. The growth opportunity here lies in the shift from unconscious patterns to conscious decisions. The avoidant has the chance to recognize that intimacy doesn't have to equal danger, that vulnerability doesn't always lead to rejection, and that silence is not abandonment. It's a boundary. If they lean into this realization, the silence can serve as a catalyst for healing, encouraging them to open up and meet the empath with more consistency and emotional presence. For the empath, the silence reinforces the importance of self-respect and demonstrates that stepping back is sometimes the most powerful way to reclaim control of their own emotional well-being. However, the silence also presents a second possible outcome: clarity that it's time to walk away. If the avoidant remains locked in their defenses, unable or unwilling to grow, the empath gains the freedom to see that the relationship cannot meet their needs. In this way, the silence functions as a filter. It separates relationships that can evolve from those that can't. Either way, growth occurs through the avoidant learning to step forward or through the empath learning that they deserve someone who will. Silence is the teacher, and what it teaches is that love is only sustainable when both people choose to show up fully. When you step back and really look at this dynamic, it becomes clear that silence isn't about punishment. It's about power, self-respect, and truth. The super empath's cold silence is the moment the game changes. It exposes the imbalance, forces the avoidant to face themselves, and reclaims control that had been given away for too long. And whether that silence pushes the avoidant to finally grow, or whether it gives the empath the clarity to walk away, it always leads to transformation. Because silence, when chosen consciously, is not empty. It's full of meaning. It says, I will no longer trade my peace for your comfort. I will no longer exhaust myself trying to be heard. If you want my presence, you must also bring yours. That's the lesson. That's the gift hidden inside what looks like absence. Silence is the empath's way of saying my love is powerful, but it is not endless. It deserves to be matched. So if you've ever been the one giving endlessly, remember, your silence might be the most powerful message you'll ever send. And if you've ever been the one who avoids, know this: silence isn't rejection. It's an invitation to step up and meet the person who's been waiting for you all along. Thank you for sharing this time with me, for listening deeply, and for reflecting on these truths. I hope you carry this with you, not just as an idea, but as a reminder that love thrives where respect and reciprocity live. Goodbye, and thank you.